October 13, 1942. Guadalcanal. Captain Joe Foss was 4 days into his first combat assignment when a Japanese Zero appeared out of nowhere and slipped into his sights. He fired one burst. The Zero went down in flames. It was his first kill. He didn't have time to think about it. 3 more Zeros were already on his tail. His engine was hit. Oil pressure dropping. The Wildcat, slower than the Zero, less maneuverable, outgunned in almost every way, was barely flying. He brought it down at Henderson Field at full speed, no flaps, dead engine, missing a grove of palm trees by feet. He climbed out of the cockpit, looked at his aircraft, and immediately started looking for another one. That was Joe Foss. He had been told he was too old to be a fighter pilot. He had been told his body wasn't right for combat aviation. He had spent 2 years fighting the United States Marine Corps bureaucracy just to get into a cockpit. And in the next 3 months, he would shoot down 26 Japanese aircraft, including some of Japan's most experienced aces, and become the most celebrated fighter pilot in America. But the Japanese didn't call him by his name. They called him something else. Something that, in their language, means ghost. Joseph Jacob Foss was born on April 17, 1915, on a farm near Sioux Falls, South Dakota. The farmhouse had no electricity. No running water. His father raised the family on what the land gave them, which was sometimes enough and sometimes wasn't. Joe Foss grew up working. Working the fields before school, working after school, working on weekends. That was simply what life was on a farm in South Dakota in the 1920s. But there was something else. When he was 12 years old, his father took him to an airfield near Sioux Falls. Charles Lindbergh was on tour with the Spirit of St. Louis, the plane he had used to cross the Atlantic, and thousands of people had come to see it. Joe Foss stood at the edge of that crowd and watched the aircraft, and something happened to him that didn't happen to most of the other 12-year-olds standing there. He decided that flying was what he was going to do with his life. 4 years later, he and his father paid $1.50 each to take their first flight in a Ford Trimitar. The feeling confirmed everything he had thought at 12. Then his father died. Joe Foss was still in high school. The farm needed to be run. His family needed to eat. He put his dreams aside and ran the farm. He did this for years, working the land, saving money, taking flying lessons whenever he could afford them, waiting for the moment when his younger brother could take over and he could go. When that moment finally came, he enrolled at the University of South Dakota. He waited tables to pay his tuition. He took every aviation course he could find. He graduated with a degree in business administration in 1939. He had over 100 hours of flight time by the time he finished college. He joined the Marines. He was 26 years old. And the Marines told him he was too old to be a fighter pilot. 26 years old. That was the verdict. Too old. The average age of a Marine fighter pilot was 22 or 23. At 26, Foss was considered past his physical peak for the demands of aerial combat, the G-forces, the reaction time, the sustained intensity of a dogfight. He was assigned to a photographic reconnaissance squadron instead. Joe Foss described the photographic curriculum as one of the hardest things he had ever done, not because it was difficult, but because it was not what he wanted. Every hour he spent studying camera systems was an hour he wasn't in a fighter cockpit. He did it anyway. He did it well. And while he was doing it, he did something else. He wangled his way into the aircraft carrier training group at North Island, California. He told them he would do all the dirty work, sweeping the hangars, handling burial details, whatever they needed. In exchange, he got access to the aircraft he wanted. He logged 156 hours in a Grumman F4F Wildcat over 6 weeks. Not authorized. Not officially approved. Just Foss, showing up, flying the plane, learning everything about it. When he reapplied for fighter duty in the summer of 1942, he had more hours in the Wildcat than almost anyone. They couldn't say no. He was transferred to Marine Fighter Squadron VMF 121 as executive officer. Second in command. Flying a combat aircraft. Finally. He was 27 years old. Pearl Harbor had happened 7 months earlier. The Pacific War was burning across the ocean. And Joe Foss, the farmer's son from South Dakota who was supposedly too old for this, was finally going where he'd always been trying to go. October 9, 1942. VMF 121 catapulted off the deck of the USS Cactus, an escort carrier, and flew 350 miles north to Guadalcanal. What they landed on was barely an airfield. Henderson Field had been seized from the Japanese 2 months earlier by the 1st Marine Division. It was a strip of brown mud and volcanic rock, riddled with bomb craters, littered with wrecked aircraft from both sides. The runway was so damaged that heavy equipment couldn't operate on it. Ground crews refueled and rearmed aircraft by hand, loading ammunition belt by belt. The Marines on the ground were holding the island by their fingernails. Japanese forces attacked day and night, from the sea, from the jungle, from the air. The airfield was the strategic prize of the entire campaign. Whoever controlled it controlled the skies over Guadalcanal. And whoever controlled the skies controlled the island. The pilots who flew from Henderson Field called themselves the Cactus Air Force, after the Allied code name for Guadalcanal. There were never enough of them. There were never enough aircraft. Half the Wildcats were unairworthy at any given time, engines failing, hydraulics leaking, battle damage unrepaired because there were no parts. Joe Foss looked at all of this and said something that people who knew him recognized as completely typical. He said he was impressed by the make-do character of the place. He was the oldest pilot in his flight. 4 years older than the average age of 23. The man they had told was too old to be a fighter pilot. For days after landing, he went up for his first combat mission. And shot down a Zero. The first kill taught him something that no training manual had adequately prepared him for. The Zero was faster. It was more maneuverable. In a turning fight, a Zero pilot could get inside a Wildcat's turning radius and put rounds into it before the American pilot could react. This was not a theory, it was a fact that was killing American pilots every week over Guadalcanal. The way to survive was to use what the Wildcat had that the Zero didn't. Speed in a dive. Armor. Firepower. 6.50 caliber machine guns that, when they connected, did things to a Zero that the Zero's lighter armament couldn't do to the Wildcat. The doctrine was hit and run. Get altitude. Dive. Fire. Climb. Never turn with a Zero. Never slow down. Never give a Zero pilot a turning engagement. Foss understood this instinctively. He also had something that younger, less experienced pilots sometimes lacked, the patience to wait for the right shot, the discipline not to chase when chasing would get him killed. He called himself Swivel-Neck Joe after his first mission. He had learned to keep his head moving constantly, checking every direction, never letting his eyes settle. In his first week of combat, he shot down 5 aircraft and became an ace. 9 days on Guadalcanal. 5 kills. Then the pace accelerated. October 23, 2 more Zeros. One of them he caught at the top of a loop, inverted, and described as a lucky shot that he'd remember for the rest of his life. October 25, 6 kills in a single day. 3 before 10 in the morning, a break for lunch, then 3 more in the afternoon. The Marine Corps' first ace in a day in World War II. The squadron he led, 8 pilots flying Wildcats in formations that the rest of the Cactus Air Force started calling acrobatic, became known as Foss's Flying Circus. The name fit. By November 19, Joe Foss had shot down 23 Japanese aircraft in 41 days. November 7, 1942. Joe Foss was strafing Japanese ships 150 miles north of Guadalcanal when a Zero he hadn't seen got behind him. Machine gun fire tore through his engine. Tore through his canopy. Passed close enough to his head that he felt it. The engine died. He had no choice. He ditched the Wildcat into the ocean. The plane hit the water and nosed forward. The impact slammed the canopy shut. Water was rising around him inside the cockpit, rising to his chin, and he couldn't get the latch open. He fought it. Desperate, both hands on the mechanism, water at his face, aircraft sinking. He got it open. He kicked free of the cockpit and surfaced. The Wildcat was already 30 feet below him, going down. He was 150 miles from Guadalcanal. He was alone. It was getting dark. And there were sharks in the water with him. Joe Foss couldn't swim. He had grown up in South Dakota. He had never learned. He floated in his life jacket and his parachute pack, treading water as best he could, as darkness fell and the sharks circled. He later wrote, "I did more praying that afternoon out there than I ever did in my life." He broke open a pouch of chlorine powder and sprinkled it in the water around him. He had read somewhere that chlorine repelled sharks. He would find out later that this was not true, that chlorine does nothing to sharks. He didn't know that at the time. He floated. He prayed. The sharks circled. Hours passed. Then, out of the darkness, came the sound of paddles. A missionary from Maleta Island, accompanied by several islanders in dugout canoes, pulled him from the water. He had been in the ocean for hours. He later said it was a good thing he hadn't known beforehand that chlorine doesn't work on sharks. The sharks didn't stop Joe Foss. Neither did what came next. In December 1942, he contracted malaria. The disease that was killing more American servicemen in the Pacific than Japanese bullets. Fever, chills, weakness, the kind of sickness that doesn't just knock you down once but comes back, cycles through your body, grinds you down over weeks and months. He was evacuated to Sydney, Australia for treatment. While he recovered, he gave lectures to RAF pilots newly assigned to the theater. He talked to Australian aces who had been fighting longer than anyone in the area and who, he noticed, were somewhat dismissive of Japanese pilots, treating them as inferior opponents. Foss didn't share that view. He had flown against them. He knew what they were capable of. He recovered. He came back. On January 1, 1943, Joe Foss returned to Guadalcanal. Still fighting the malaria, still not fully healthy, but back. On January 15, he shot down 3 more aircraft. His total was now 26. He had equaled the record held by Eddie Rickenbacker, America's top ace from the First World War, who had shot down 25 German aircraft in 1918. Rickenbacker's record had stood for 24 years. In 3 months of combat over Guadalcanal, flying a slower, less maneuverable aircraft than the ones trying to kill him, Joe Foss had matched it. America now had a new ace of aces. 10 days after his 26th kill, Joe Foss flew what may have been his most important mission of the war. And he didn't fire a single shot. A massive Japanese force was inbound, bombers and Zero escorts, heading for Henderson Field with the intention of destroying it completely. The airfield that the entire Guadalcanal campaign had been fought over. The strip of mud and craters that the Cactus Air Force had been defending for months. Foss went up with 11 other pilots to intercept. He analyzed the formation as it approached. He could see immediately what the Japanese were doing. The Zero fighters were positioned to draw the Americans into a turning engagement while the bombers slipped through. It was a trap. And it was well designed. Foss made a decision that went against every instinct a fighter pilot has. He didn't attack. Instead, he ordered his flight to stay high, circling in a defensive formation called a luftbury, a wheel in the sky that presents no easy target and looks, from a distance, like a decoy. The Japanese Zero pilots looked up at this circling formation and made a calculation. They assumed it was a lure, that there were more American fighters hidden in the clouds above, waiting to pounce. They hesitated. They circled. They burned fuel. When the Japanese fighters finally turned for home, worried about running out of fuel before they could engage, the bombers had no choice but to follow. Henderson Field was never attacked. Joe Foss later said it was his most satisfying mission of the entire war. He hadn't fired a single round. In the spring of 1943, Joe Foss was ordered home. Malaria. Exhaustion. The medical corps had decided his body had taken enough. His war in the Pacific, at least this chapter of it, was over. In May 1943, President Franklin D. Roosevelt presented Joe Foss with the Medal of Honor at a White House ceremony. The citation read, in part, for outstanding heroism and courage above and beyond the call of duty. Engaging in almost daily combat with the enemy from October 9 to November 19, 1942, Captain Foss personally shot down 23 Japanese aircraft. Life magazine put him on its cover on June 7, 1943. The headline, America's #1 ace. He was 28 years old. He looked, people said, like John Wayne, 6 feet tall, curly hair, a cigar usually somewhere nearby. He had been told he was too old for combat aviation at 26. He was sent on a national tour, war bond rallies, factory visits, recruitment drives. America needed heroes in 1943, and Joe Foss was exactly what the country needed to see. But there was something happening in the Pacific that made all of this more than just a story about one extraordinary pilot. The Japanese had been keeping records. In their reports from the air battles over Guadalcanal, Japanese commanders had noted the existence of a pilot whose behavior didn't match the patterns they expected from Americans. He attacked from unexpected angles. He waited when others would charge. He survived situations that should have killed him: the ocean, the sharks, the malaria, the aircraft shot out from under him. He seemed to appear where he wasn't supposed to be. He disappeared when they thought they had him. The Japanese pilots at Guadalcanal had a word for what Joe Foss seemed to be. Ghost. After the war, Joe Foss went home to South Dakota. He started a flying service. He bought a car dealership. He helped build the South Dakota Air National Guard from scratch, eventually rising to the rank of brigadier general. Then he ran for the state legislature. 1. Ran for governor at 39. Won that too, the youngest governor in South Dakota history at the time. Then he was named the first commissioner of the American Football League, the upstart league that would eventually merge with the NFL. He ran it for 6 years and helped give it the foundation it needed to survive. Then president of the National Rifle Association. Then television broadcaster. Then national speaker. Then elder statesman of American aviation, giving speeches at air shows and veterans events well into his 80s, still with the cigar, still with the directness that had always been there. In January 2002, 86 years old and carrying every decoration the United States Marine Corps had to offer, Joe Foss was passing through security at Phoenix's Sky Harbor Airport. The screeners stopped him. They had found 3 suspicious items. A key holder made from a dummy bullet. A small nail file. And a 5-pointed star with a ribbon attached. The Medal of Honor. Security held him for 2 hours before anyone recognized what the medal was. Joe Foss thought it was funny. "I never did get mad," he said afterward. "I just thought it was a good thing that my grandchildren weren't there to see it." He died on January 1, 2003. New Year's Day. He was 87 years old. He is buried at Arlington National Cemetery. The farm in South Dakota where he grew up, no electricity, no running water, a family running on what the land provided, is long gone now. But the name is still there, in the records of one of the most extraordinary combat records in the history of American aviation. 26 kills. In 3 months. In a slower plane. Against opponents who had been flying in combat since BFO.